This is the Anthrobiology Podcast, hosted by me, Gabby LaPera. Every 2 weeks, I interview a biological anthropologist about what makes us, us. Hello there, everyone. Welcome to another show. On today's episode, I talked to Dr. Daniel Lieberman of Harvard University. I was really excited to interview him, maybe a little embarrassingly so, but that's okay. We should never be embarrassed about being excited about knowledge. On today's episode, you are going to hear about mismatch diseases and evolutionary medicine. I thought that this would be a great follow-up to Dr. David Reichland's show. One thing that I wanted to apologize for is that there is some background noise. There's some birds a-chirping, and honestly, I'm not a good enough editor to figure out how to get that out of there, so just enjoy. Pretend like you're outside in the summertime listening to me and Dr. Lieberman talk. It'll be nice. Soothing, even. The third thing that I wanted to bring up with y'all is that I encourage you to do a little bit of experimentation after listening to this show. Think about how you walk around and how you run around. Don't worry, there's more guidance within the show itself. As usual, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me at gabby.lapera@anthrobiology.com, or you can find me on Twitter and Instagram, both at Anthrobiology. I hope everyone is staying safe and having a wonderful day. Enjoy! Hello, everyone. This is Gabby LaPera. Welcome to another episode of the Anthrobiology Podcast. I am so excited today to welcome Dr. Daniel Lieberman of Harvard to the show. I have to admit, Dr. Lieberman, you have been one of my academic crushes for like the last decade. I've always been so interested and impressed by your research, and I'm so amped to have you on the show. Welcome.
Oh, well, I'm equally delighted to be here. Thank you.
Do you want to tell the listeners a little bit about who you are and what type of research you do?
So I have the good fortune to be a professor in the Department of Human Evolutionary Biology at Harvard. I'm also in the Department of Organismic and Evolutionary Biology. And my research really is about how and why the human body is the way it is. And really, I started off as a head guy, focusing on the evolution of the human head. But over the years, I've become more and more interested and now really focus on the evolution of human physical activity. And I'm interested in how and why we evolved to be both inactive, but also active, and what kind of activity, and how that's relevant to health. Because I think that one of the important tasks for us today is to figure out how what we do is relevant to the world as a whole, how to make the world a better place.
Yes, and this is actually one of the reasons that I like your work so much, is that I have kind of categorized it in my head as a type of functional evolutionary research. Sometimes it's a little bit harder in anthropology to understand how someone's research directly relates to us today, but I feel like you do a really good job in all of your work of saying, this is why this thing that happened 1 million years ago matters today, right now.
Thank you. Well, I kind of had a midlife crisis, many years ago over just that topic. I wrote a book. My first book is called The Evolution of the Human Head, and I don't want to admit how long I spent writing that book or working on that book. I did other things while working on the book. But I remember when I finished the book, I was like, who's going to read this? And who cares about it? And, I'm proud of the book. But in the meantime, we were also publishing about running and barefoot running. And the relative amount of attention, first of all, got my attention. But also, I realized that the work that we were doing about the evolution of running had real implications in terms of fitness and injury and disease, and it just kind of touched a nerve, not just with people, but with me. And it got me interested in evolutionary medicine. But so much of evolutionary medicine is very theoretical, and there's not that much actually human evolution in evolutionary medicine. And I got interested in what is it that happened in our evolutionary history that made us the kind of athletes that we are. And how can we help use that information to help us avoid injury and exercise better and understand the fact that we hate to exercise and all those other issues that really matter to people. I think we underestimate just how important evolutionary theory and data are to people's lives, and I think there's probably many more applications.
Yeah, definitely. And there's so much to pull apart in what you just said. Let's start with the fact that you have a really broad range of research interests. They all definitely tie together, but one of the things that you mentioned was the evolution of running, which is actually how I first got interested in your work, was because I had a knee injury and I went to my physical therapist and they said, so you have two options. You can either run with knee braces and orthotics, or I just read this article about barefoot running. Do you want to try that instead? And being the eager beaver undergraduate anthropologist that I went and I was like, well, I'm going to learn more about this barefoot running. And I did completely switch my running style and all my knee problems went away and it was great. Note to everyone listening, please be careful if you decide to switch your running style. It can result in injuries. I definitely felt the burn for quite a while. But yeah, let's talk a little bit about humans as runners. I think that this is a really interesting idea about how running has played into human evolution. Do you want to start with bipedalism? This is like a whole huge topic.
Oh my God! So, well, I mean, let's combine the two, because I think it's an interesting question that you asked. So in 2004, Dennis Bramble and I published a paper in Nature about the evolution of endurance running in the genus Homo, but the title of the cover of Nature, which we were the cover of Nature that week,
congratulations,
was Born to Run, which was the perfect cover. And when the paper came out, you're always excited to have a paper in Nature. That's always really very exciting. You're going to get a fair amount of attention, and when you get the cover, you get even more attention. But Dennis and I were just blown away by how much press that got. I mean, neither of us were prepared for it. We were in over 1,000 newspapers. We were on the front page of the New York Times and Pravda and People's Daily. It was kind of crazy. It was insane. It took over my life for a while. But that was, it was exciting. But what's interesting is that the first group of people who were really interested and excited by it, who just bought it instantly, were people in sports medicine and runners. But a lot of anthropologists were initially very skeptical because, we think about human evolution as being about walking, about bipedalism. So often you'll read about bipedalism and the only gait they talk about is walking. And I don't disagree with that. When I walk out the door, well, I usually walk out the door, not run out of the door. Mm-hmm. And most of the people I see locomoting are walking. And so there's no question that walking is the most fundamental and basic and important human gait. That's what set us off on a different evolutionary path from the apes, really, from the chimpanzee lineage. So, one of the criticisms, I think, initially, or skepticism, was that they thought we were somehow discounting the importance of walking. And in no way did we ever say that or think that, but we have this kind of trade-off mentality, I think, sometimes in science. What we think happened is that initially, the hominins evolved to walk and climb. So creatures like Ardipithecus and maybe Sahelanthropus. I mean, we have some evidence that Sahelanthropus was a biped. And these very, very early hominins were walkers and probably climbers, and certainly the Australopiths were walkers and climbers. But then there was another shift that occurred around sometime between 3 and 2 million years ago, where we gave up climbing for the most part. I mean, obviously, there are some people who still climb a little bit, but we're not very good at it. But the trade-off was between climbing and running. And so a lot of the adaptations that we got for long-distance running, I think, are what caused us to lose some of the features for climbing. Because, why, for example, can you not be a walker and have nice long arms and curved fingers and upwardly mobile shoulders and all those good things that are good for climbing? Walking never explained that. And the evolution of walking never explained why we have all sorts of features in our bodies that help us run but don't really help us walk, like having an enlarged cranial portion of the gluteus maximus, or the long Achilles tendon, or the short forearms, or I could go on and on. There's tons of features in our bodies. And so what we argued really was that running also played an important role in human evolution, not discounting the importance of walking, but we evolved to be both runners and walkers. But we live in a world today where we don't have to run anymore. And so it's kind of hard for us to appreciate that because, life doesn't require us to run. Some of us do it for fun, but, how many of us go and run down kudus, every once in a while? It doesn't happen.
Just for listeners, a kudzu is a type of African deer, I guess would be the best way to describe it.
Yeah, it's an antelope. It's
It's an antelope. So let's talk a little bit about the types of adaptations that you see for running. You mentioned the bigger gluteal muscles. You mentioned some of the cranial adaptations. Do you want to kind of dig into those a little bit? What are the things that really set us apart and really set us up for running? So, for example, I think the thing that always comes to mind for me is the fact that we are furless, right? It's a lot easier to dissipate heat through our skin.
So, as you well know, it's very difficult to ascribe adaptations sometimes to a particular
Mm-hmm.
function. So there are features that make us better at running, that improve our performance. And for some of them, it's not quite clear whether they evolve for running or walking. Like being furless, for example, and being able to sweat. One of the things that we've worked on in my lab is we've tried to count up actually how many eccrine glands, sweat glands, there are in humans compared to chimpanzees. And we have a lot more. We have millions and millions more than a chimpanzee. Now, did that evolve for walking or for running? It's very hard to know. Or long legs, for example, improve our performance for both walking and running. But there are other features which really kind of don't make much sense for walking. So one of them is having short toes. We did one fun study which showed that having really long toes, like an Australopithecine, like Lucy, don't actually compromise your performance in walking. You can walk with very long toes and you're fine. But when you start running and you have really long toes, the torques, the forces that act around the toes are really too high, and you'll actually break your toes if you have really long toes, if you're a runner. We have an arch in our foot, for example, which you don't need for walking. There are plenty of people with flat feet who can walk just fine. But if they run, they have real troubles. We have a long Achilles tendon. In fact, our legs are loaded with these really long tendons. And tendons are like springs, and running is a spring-like gait. So in running, you're essentially jumping from one leg to the other, and you're storing up elastic energy in all those tendons, and they're helping push you up into the air. There's no spring motion in walking, and you don't need long tendons. There's actually no benefit having long tendons. What you lose from having long tendons, you lose the ability to produce forces over a wide range of motions. So long tendons like Achilles and the posterior tibialis and the anterior tibialis and etc. The IT band we've shown is important for running. Having a enlarged gluteus maximus, it's a very simple experiment. Some of you may have seen, I got Colbert to do this actually once, but if you just walk around and put your hand on your butt, right? It's like having an electromyography machine, right? And you can feel that if you're just walking, the upper portion of your gluteus maximus is really doing nothing. It's not really involved in walking. As soon as you start running, it actually fires twice per stride. Some of its major function is to prevent the trunk from falling forward so you don't fall over when you run. So having a big butt is really important for running. And the ability to twist your torso independently of your hips. So when you're walking, there's some rotation, but when you're running, that counter rotation of your hips and torso is crucial to maintaining a balance so you don't sort of turn in the air. The same is true of separating your shoulders from your head. So we've lost all these muscles for climbing. And then we have this cool system. We actually have a paper in review right now, but we've also published a little bit on this before, showing that your arm actually counterbalances your head, so it prevents your head from pitching forward every time your body hits the ground. We have all kinds of heat dumping mechanisms in our head. We have enlarged semicircular canals, which are the rate gyros in our heads, which prevent our heads from pitching. And that's not a big issue when you walk, but it's a big issue when you... I could go on, right? So you get the sense. There are a lot of features that our bodies have which make us really good, not so much at sprinting, because we're terrible at going fast, but make us really good at running long distances at very moderate paces.
So what I want listeners to do is I want all of you, after this episode is over, I want you to go outside and I want you to go for a walk. And then I want you to alternate between walking and running. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to put your hands on the very top of your booty, and you're going to feel the difference in the muscle firing that Dr. Lieberman described. And then I want you to try, maybe don't do this where all your neighbors can see you because they might think you're crazy, but I want you to then try walking and running while keeping your torso completely still, and then walking and running while keeping your arms completely still. And just if you want, feel free to tweet at me and let me know how that feels for you.
That actually reminds me of a funny story. So, I like to run. And I was thinking about some of these mechanisms once when I was running in an early morning run here in Cambridge. And I was trying not to move my arms just as I just kept thinking about it, right? Because we were doing some experiments, actually with Dave Reichland, who I think you had on your show. He was a postdoc in my lab. And so we were doing this, but we called it the straitjacket experiment. But basically we would tie people's arms down. I mean, not so that they couldn't get their arms out if they fell, but we were trying to restrict arm movement, and I was running through a park, trying not to move my arms, trying to think about how my head was moving, or I don't remember exactly. And I remember there was a guy walking, it was like a grandfather walking his grandchild to school, because early in the morning, and I remember him saying loud enough that I could hear, he said, "Oh, Louise, that man can't run very well." So be careful, when you do these little experiments, you never know how it's going to embarrass you.
I feel like that's so many runners' nightmares. Like we all convince ourselves like no one's really looking at me run. Lots of people are watching you run, but that's okay. You should do it anyway.
I mean, I think our bodies are. It's one of the fun things about studying the human body is that we can experiment on ourselves in all kinds of fun ways. There's so much to learn about human evolution and human anatomy just from our own bodies. And I think one of the interesting things also about running is the whole debate about barefoot running. Is how many people are afraid of it and have never really tried it, or if they've done it, they've only done it on a lawn or a beach, and they've never tried to run barefoot in the kinds of environments we're involved to run in, or to walk in. I mean, barefoot walking, for that matter. It doesn't mean you should be a barefoot runner or a barefoot walker, but I think it's really fun to experiment with your own, be a participant observer, right? And use your own body to kind of try to understand it better. It's something I really think more people should do.
Yeah, I mean, I personally have experimented on myself with that, and I have really enjoyed the results of it. I want to kind of transition into another area of your research, which is mismatch diseases. And this actually ties into your running research as well, but can you first describe what a mismatch disease is?
So I define a mismatch disease as a disease or a condition that's more common or more severe because our bodies are either inadequately or imperfectly adapted to novel environments. So all aspects of our bodies, our phenotypes, are a combination of genes and environment, right? There's a complex interaction. And genes change slowly, but environments, boy, can they change fast and powerfully, particularly because of cultural evolution. And so as a result, all organisms go through mismatches, when the environment changes or if they disperse into a new habitat. But humans, especially since agriculture and industrial revolution, we've created an extraordinary number of mismatches that we contend with, and many of them are infectious diseases. I mean, you could argue that COVID-19 is a mismatch. We wouldn't be having this kind of pandemic if it weren't for high population densities and humans living cheek by jowl with all kinds of animals. But also many mismatch diseases are non-contagious, sort of chronic, non-infectious diseases like diabetes and heart disease and, the serious things, some cancers, but also less serious things like myopia and flat feet and lower back pain maybe. I mean, the list is very long.
Yeah, no, it certainly is. I earlier this year came to suffer from what is affectionately called gamer neck. Apparently, it's where everyone can do this. Just if you take your head and kind of jut it forward, your chin forward, and hold it like that for a really long time, it can put a lot of stress on your occipital nerves, and you get these insane headaches from occipital neuralgia. There you go. Mismatch disease right here, right now.
My favorite must be selfie deaths, right? I mean, not, I mean, the dangerous things people do with selfies. Right? Yeah. Definitely a mismatch.
Yeah. So actually, one thing I want to get at real quick, this is a question that I have been asked so many times in every intro to biological anthropology class I've ever taken from friends who are not anthropologists. Have humans stopped evolving?
Oh, absolutely no. I mean, gosh, I mean, that's a resounding no. I mean, evolution is just change over time, right? And of course we're changing. And furthermore, natural selection, the kind of evolution we typically think about, is just the emergent outcome of heritable variation and differential reproductive success. And we still have heritable variation, and we still have differential reproductive success. I mean, I have one daughter, and my brother has two kids, right? So he's got twice the reproductive output of me. And if, that's a big if, there's any genetic basis for those differences, then you'll have evolution. So no, you can't stop evolution. It's like stopping gravity. And furthermore, we're also creating all kinds of novel selective forces by changing our diets and the animals we live around. I mean, infectious disease is an important, strong selective force. The climates that we live in, the foods that we eat. So evolution hasn't stopped. But the flip side is that we're also creating all kinds of cultural solutions. So we have this kind of complex interaction between culture and natural selection. And there's no question that cultural evolution and cultural shifts are happening at a much greater rate, that they're swamping our natural selection, so it's kind of hard to see it. For example, in Framingham, Massachusetts, which is right outside of Boston, I go there regularly. In fact, the Boston Marathon, mile 6 of Boston Marathon runs through Framingham. And Framingham is famous because it's been one of the longest longitudinal studies of human health. It's where the word risk factor comes from. It's from the Framingham Heart Study. Started a long time ago. So because we have 3 generations of data now from Framingham, people have been able to show actually evidence for natural selection in Framingham. It's not huge selection, but we can now statistically prove, that there's actually been slight selection in Framingham for women who are slightly shorter and slightly plumper
Interesting.
over one generation. Now, that doesn't mean that next generation it'll be the same, right? Selection could change. We can actually measure selection happening in human populations today.
Yes. Yes. Thank you for answering that question so coherently and completely. I think the other side of this is we are continuing to evolve, yes, but we are also dealing with the outcomes of evolution from a grand scale, and that's where your mismatch diseases come in.
No question about it. We have an epidemic now of chronic non-infectious diseases. The number one cause of death in the United States is heart disease. Mm-hmm. And if you go to populations, subsistence populations, small-scale societies, there's almost no evidence for it, right? There was a wonderful paper that was published in The Lancet 2 or 3 years ago by the Chimani research group, Kaplan et al., in The Lancet, showing that these forager farmers in the Amazon have no coronary calcifications in their coronary arteries. They just basically, they have perfect coronary arteries. We have data from numerous populations. We've published it from the Tarahumara in Mexico. Others like Dave Reichland and Herman Ponzer have published data on hypertension in the Hadza. There's data from going back to the 1970s on hypertension in the Kalahari, among the hunter-gatherers in the Kalahari. There's actually dozens and dozens of studies from around the world showing that unlike Western populations where hypertension, blood pressure increases with age, in most of these populations there is no measurable increase in blood pressure with age. That's just one example among many of mismatched diseases that are occurring because of our changes in diet, changes in physical activity, changes in stress. All of these wreak havoc on the human body, but for most of them, they don't tend to cause illness until we're in our 50s or 60s.
So we've already reproduced.
Exactly. So they're generally silent to selection. So they're accruing, causing morbidity and mortality, but they're probably not under strong selective pressure.
Yeah. And one thing I wanted to call out, something that we chatted about beforehand, and for listeners, this is part of my commitment to talk about race more often on this podcast. A lot of these mismatched diseases, a lot of them disproportionately affect certain segments of the population. And that's one of the reasons it's really important to study them and talk about them.
I completely agree. And a lot of these mismatches have a strong social determinant. It used to be that the only people who could afford to eat really bad diets and not exercise were the wealthy. And now it's completely reversed. So we live in this kind of paradoxical situation where people who are privileged are able to have the free time to go and exercise. That's the modern version of physical activity, because none of us, or very few of us in places like the United States, have to be physically active to get dinner. Most of us sit in chairs all day long. So physical activity is now a privilege for people who aren't constantly commuting and working sometimes multiple jobs. Getting healthy food is, again, a privilege of the wealthy because it's cheaper to have processed food that has had all its fiber removed and various things like that make it less healthy. And we see this not just in the United States, but also we see this in other populations. So we, for example, just did a study in the Tarahumara in Mexico. We were interested in whether or not their rates of arthritis was in that population. And we expected to see lower rates of arthritis because they're a very physically active population. We were looking in the knee. We actually were comparing the Tarahumara to the Framingham study. So because we had fantastic longitudinal data from Framingham of the sort of rates of arthritis at given ages, and we have everybody's body weights and all that kind of stuff. And we were surprised to find high levels of arthritis in this very physically active population, when we've already shown, and other people have shown, that physical activity lowers rates of arthritis. And the answer to that is that they have what is sometimes called a thrifty phenotype, is that as environments are changing in Mexico, which has a lot of processed food, as people are drinking more Coca-Cola and eating more processed food, they're getting a lot of visceral fat, belly fat. And we know that that kind of fat causes inflammation, chronic inflammation, and arthritis is an inflammatory disease. And it makes those populations, especially people who are born in low energy environments, and they start having high energy environments, they're extra vulnerable to some of these inflammatory diseases like arthritis and heart disease, diabetes, which is also a big problem in this population. So it's another dimension of how class and privilege and race interact to affect people's health.
Yeah, certainly. And listeners, I just want to hop in here real quick and talk about epigenetics for a second, because you were using the words thrifty phenotype and talking about low energy versus high energy environments. Epigenetics is the study of how much a gene is turned on or off. So how much it's expressed is the way that it's said in biology. And we know that certain types of environments cause genes to turn off or turn on. And honestly, genes are more like a dimmer switch, right? It's less like an on and off light switch. It's more like a dimmer switch. Different types of environments set that dimmer at different levels. And the environment that you're born into, that your natal environment, that can have long-term effects over the course of your lifetime. I promise to have an epigeneticist on here at some point because I love epigenetics. It's super interesting. But that's kind of what we're getting at with the thrifty phenotype. Going back to diet, I do want to ask you about something that my friends constantly ask me about, which is the paleo diet. Is this a solution to all of our ills?
Well, the paleo diet is actually both frustrating, but it's also an opportunity, because paleo diet is a great way to illustrate how not to think about how to apply evolution to health.
Okay.
So the paleo diet is this idea that if you only ate like, which is, by the way, trademarked, by the way.
No.
Lauren Cordain trademarked the term. But so there is a paleo diet, not many paleo diets, which is one of the funny things to me, because obviously everywhere you work in the world, there were different paleo diets. But anyway, the idea behind the paleo diet is that if you ate how supposedly cavemen, and that's what often they say, cavemen, for some reason I guess cave women didn't eat, but anyway,
no, none of us.
Then that will make you healthy. And so they have this idea that you should eat as much saturated fat as possible. Legumes are out. You can't have any peanuts, no lentils, no beans. That's verboten. Dairy products are completely forbidden. Grains and cereals, forbidden. Any processed food that has lots of sugar in it is forbidden. So some of these things are okay. I mean, I think it's good to cut down on products that have a lot of sugar and that are highly processed. But I'm sorry, I'm not giving up legumes, and I don't buy the idea that our ancestors didn't eat cereals. We actually have good archaeological data that they did. But even more importantly, as to what the paleo diet is, the biggest problem with the paleo diet is the assumption that it is healthy, because it's a misunderstanding of natural selection. Remember, natural selection cares about, really, sadly, it cares about one thing and one thing only, which is how many offspring we have who survive and reproduce. And so we're adapted not to be healthy per se. We're adapted to be healthy only to the extent that health promotes reproductive success. And so what really matters is energy, because the basic equation of life is energy in, babies out. That's basically what life is about, right? Mm-hmm. More energy means more babies. And so we're clearly adapted to have as much energy as possible and to use as little energy as possible. That's why, there's an escalator next to a stairway. Most of us take the escalator, right? Because it's, even though we never had escalators in our evolutionary history, it's instinctive to avoid unnecessary exertion. And it's instinctive to reach for the chocolate cake, which sadly also we didn't have until recently in human evolution, but there we are. But it's also instinctive to go for honey, which is the favorite food of hunter-gatherers. So the paleo diet is based on a false premise. It's based on this idea that somehow an ancestral diet is necessarily healthy. And it's true that some modern diets do cause mismatches, but not all. Mismatch is a hypothesis that you have to test. You can't just assume it. That's the sort of the naturalistic fallacy, that if it's modern, it must be bad. If it's ancestral, it must be good. And that's, to me, the biggest problem with the paleo diet. Plus, there are also serious data problems. I mean, the idea that you can eat as much saturated fat and not pay a price in terms of heart disease is just wrong. It's based on a selective reading of the literature that it does not stand up to scrutiny. There are some papers which claim that you can eat as much saturated fat as you want and it doesn't cause any increased risk in heart disease, but those papers tend not to look at what you replace the saturated fat with. So if you just look at how much saturated fat you have in your diet, yeah, you might come up with that conclusion. But if you look at what kind of fats you're eating, like if you replace saturated fat with carbohydrate, with potato chips, yeah, you're gonna have just as much heart disease. But if you replace saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat, there's abundant, clear, and uncontroversial evidence that you can lower your rates of heart disease. So just gulping down as much saturated fat as you want is just not a good idea.
You heard it here. Paleo diet, not really a thing.
Yeah.
Can we talk about how you can apply evolution to medicine in a way that works instead?
Oh gosh, there's so many ways. I mean, I think the most important application of evolution to medicine is prevention. Because the problem with our medical system is we don't see doctors until we're sick, right? If I walk into a doctor's office with cancer, it's too late to prevent it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And right at that point, I just want to figure out how to deal with that cancer. Although I think evolution can help us deal with cancer. By the way, I just read this wonderful book by Athena Actipus about cancer. It was just fantastic, evolutionary approach to cancer. But anyway, there are other ways in which we can apply evolution to medicine, and one of them is, for example, attention to whether or not we're treating symptoms rather than the causes of disease. So often we treat symptoms without thinking about their causes, but evolution helps us think about in terms of mismatch, in terms of causes, so we can avoid it. Cancer is a good example. A large percentage of cancers are preventable. We don't think about that. We just think about how to kill cancer. But it turns out, for example, physical activity can lower your risk of breast cancer or colon cancer or prostate cancer substantially. We're talking 30 to 60%, depending upon the study and the particular kind of cancer. And we actually understand why, because we live in environments where we're now in constant positive energy balance, or very rarely in negative energy balance. I.e., we're very rarely spending less energy than we're taking in, and our bodies quickly detect that signal and they think positive energy balance. And remember the equation, right? Energy in, babies out. So we start producing more hormones to increase our reproductive output, and those hormones may have a benefit for reproduction, but they also increase our risk of certain kinds of cancers. And the list goes on. In terms of shoes, in terms of diet, we can learn a lot about how to prevent diseases by thinking about them from a mismatch perspective. We can also use comparative data from other animals to test models and hypotheses about the ways in which diseases are caused, what's called the pathophysiology and etiology of disease. We can learn about to what extent mice are a relevant model sometimes, because we use mice all the time for studying disease, and the evolutionary perspective helps us think about and analyze those data. There's so many ways in which we can use evolution to apply evolution to medicine. I mean, it's a whole field, evolutionary medicine, with journals now and books. And I think it's one of the most important contributions that biological anthropology can make to the world as a whole is evolutionary medicine.
That was very, very well said. I don't have anything to add to that. Thank you. I do want to get into one other thing before we wrap up, which is looking at your research subjects. So you have worked a lot with the Tarahumara of Mexico, and you've worked a lot with people who live in Framingham, Massachusetts. What is that like? Are there any challenges? Is the first part of the question. And the second part of the question is, do you think about the type of research subjects that you have and what that means in terms of being able to apply your findings on a broader scale?
Well, we also work in Kenya, too. We've been working for over 10 years now in Western Kenya. This is a huge topic.
It's a huge topic.
I think there's several dimensions. So one dimension is that actually just published a paper on this topic. The vast majority of research that's done in the world today on disease and health is done on Western populations, right? The vast majority of researchers are in countries like the US and England and Sweden and whatever, Australia, what my colleague Joe Henrich calls weird populations, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And we think weird people are normal because we, being the people who are, you and I talking, right, are Western educated, rich and democratic.
Yep.
But that's actually about 12% of the world. And it doesn't reflect what humans were like in the past. And it leaves out the rest of the world. And we need to do more research on the health and the bodies and the activities of other people. So Mike Girvin and I actually just published this paper looking at what percentage of medical literature is based on weird populations. So we took an entire year and looked at the number of publications in the Lancet, the New England Journal of Medicine, and the Journal of the American Medical Association, so the three top medical journals. And what do you know? Something like 80s, I can't remember the exact number, but 88% or something of all the subjects and all the topics and everything is on this tiny little segment of the world. And that leaves out the rest of the world. We can't just study ourselves. If you're interested in global health and you're interested in diversity, which those of us in biological anthropology are, we need to include the rest of the world in terms of our study, but we also need to include them in terms of the actual research. So when we work in Mexico and when we work in Kenya, we include and we work with colleagues there. We try to engage the communities in the research as well. So we've actually been working to educate send kids to school. And actually, we've been reaping the dividends because recently now, we've been working there long enough that some of the kids from this area that we work, which is, we work in an area where there's no roads, there's no electricity, there's no water, there's running water. But we now sent kids through college, and now they can work with us in the field and help us collect data, which has been really, really rewarding and fun. So we work with the communities because we want to make sure that the research not only is useful for the world as a whole, but also for those communities as well. And I think that's an obligation that all of us have, to study diversity, promote diversity, and to be inclusive in our research, not only questions, but also how we conduct the research.
Definitely. I think that is something that historically has been definitely overlooked by biological anthropology, and I'm very heartened to see that a lot of people are thinking about it a lot more. For the second half of my question, I realized I asked you a huge question, and I was like, answer it all. So the second half of my question, you know what? Forget it. You answered my whole question. We're going to move on.
Oh, okay. I mean,
unless there's anything else you would like to say about that.
Well, this is a huge topic. I mean, there's so much to talk about. Well, let me just say one more thing, because we're in a moment in the United States, especially, where we're really being asked, and we should think about how the work that we do and the systems that we have fit into sort of the larger context of diversity and inclusion and oppression. And that applies to academia as well in all kinds of dimensions, in terms of who are professors, who are students, but also applies to our research agenda. And I think that one of the contributions that biological anthropology and anthropology as a whole can make is to help to address some of these issues. And I'll just give a concrete example. I think so much of anthropology was about studying the other. You go out and study other people. And we still do that to an extent. But my goal is not to study other people because they're other. What I really want to do is understand diversity and understand how we use our bodies and how we can not only help bodies in the Western world, but also bodies in the non-Western world. And that means getting to know people and embedding yourself in the community. And so one of the things that we just found that I got very interested in was studying the Tarahumara, who call themselves the Raramuri, by the way. So they became super famous because of the bestseller Born to Run, which actually started partly because of my research. But Born to Run, the title of the book said, a hidden tribe of super athletes, and advertised them as being barefoot, and basically they get out of bed in the morning and they just run 50 miles for the hell of it. And, the first time I went there to study their running, I was traveling alone, basically. I hired a local and just traveled around the area. It was kind of an amazing adventure, actually. And one of the things I noticed was that I never saw anybody running, and nobody was barefoot. And I started wondering, what the earth is going on? And I was measuring people's feet, and I was setting up little tracks, and I did see people run when I paid them to. I was asking people to run, so I studied their biomechanics, but that's the only time they ever run. And when I would ask people when they run, they would when do they run? They either run for these races, these games that they have called the Rara Hepri for men and the Arawete for women. The only other time they run is when they chase goats. And that's what they would say. And when I asked them about training, how do they train for these long distance races? I had this questionnaire, a good anthropologist had a set of questions, and, through a translator, because I don't speak Raramuri. So I had a translator, and the translator was really having a hard time with this one question, how do you train for running? And eventually the translator was like, you've got to stop asking this question. We got to rephrase this question. It's not working. Because they're mystified, because it turns out there's no concept for training in that culture. Nobody gets out and runs a 5-mile run in the morning, to prepare for a race. And what we learned by working with the Tarahumara is that they're not great runners because they're not, uncontaminated by civilization, which is what the book argued. It's not because Nike and Gatorade have destroyed them, right? The reason they're great runners, that was sort of the argument of the book, the reason they're great runners is that they care about it. And what we found out was that by talking to people is that running is actually a form of prayer. For them, running is a way to connect with the ancestor world, and these games that they have are sacred, and they're also community building events, and they run to help each other. They bet money and goats and clothes and whatever, and it helps the community, and it's how people get together. And most of them don't run long distances. There's only a small group of champion runners who are really great at it. And it's really humbling, I think, to learn about that, to realize that instead of thinking about the Tarahumara as being different, they're actually the same. They're like us. They struggle. They get nausea. Running a 50 miles is just as hard for them as it is for us. And it's important to them. And we need to celebrate that kind of diversity. And we can learn a lot from that, not only to help us, but to help them. I think the more we engage with people in a kind of a deep way, rather than just to ask one question, I think the more we can break down barriers and stereotypes. And I think that's another role that we can play in our field, is to engage in this kind of multidimensional research when we study diversity of people, because that's important.
Yeah. It's about understanding our sameness and also celebrating our differences.
Yeah, in a respectful way.
I've just really enjoyed talking to you.
Oh, well.
But don't go just yet, because we have the final portion of the interview. So my first question for you is, what are you reading or consuming for fun right now? It could be a book, podcast, television show, whatever.
Oh, gosh. Well, right now I'm actually reading an amazing book called So You Want to Talk About Race, which I think is just an amazing book. It's an important book, and I'm just absorbed by it. I think it's a topic that I think we all need to confront right now and think about. The last book I read just before that was actually a wonderful book called Some Assembly Required by Neil Shubin, which is a fantastic book about Evo Devo, but he kind of tells the sort of history of Evo Devo, and it's sort of wonderfully integrated, beautifully written. And I'm always keep a book of fiction going all the time. It's like a rule of my life. I never not have a piece of fiction going. So sometimes I'm reading more than a book at the same time.
If you were to look underneath my bed, you would see two books at any given time. One is my nonfiction, and one is my fiction book. And just depending, if it's late at night, I know I can't read fiction because I get way too amped and I can't sleep.
Right.
So same. Do you want to share what you're reading in terms of fiction right now?
Oh, well, right now I'm reading a trilogy actually by a Canadian author named Robertson Davies. It's called the Deptford Trilogy, and the first book is called Fifth Business, and the second book is called The Manticore, and I just love these books. It's about, first of all, he writes, I'm just jealous of his writing, but he writes about, it's about psychology and about the consequence of events, and about ego and about fate. They're incredibly wonderful, erudite, witty books that are just, they're captivating. And right now I need to be captivated, because it's been a challenging few months, and sometimes you just have to turn off your brain and just get a little bit of
get a little bit of cotton candy for your brain.
Get a little bit of cotton candy, but it's really just, these are the kind of books you just fall into. One of my favorite authors.
So, second question, if someone wanted to learn more about your research and the type of work you do, what would be a good kind of introductory text or resource for them to look at?
Well, so a few years ago I published a book called The Story of the Human Body. So that's kind of a summary. It was written in 2013. But I just have a new book coming out, so it just happens to be entitled Exercised, and it's kind of a natural history of physical activity, actually physical inactivity and activity. And it's very much geared towards how you can relate an evolutionary approach to the body to health and disease. It's coming out September 8th, so I think that would be a good. And my website, I try to put as many papers as I possibly can that don't get me in trouble with the with the journals on my website. So if you go to my website, most of the PDFs are available there.
Yes, I can vouch for that. And I can vouch for the fact that your last book, The Story of the Human Body, was excellent. As we've already established, I am wild about your work. So,
well, thank you.
Number 3, what are you reading for work right now?
Oh, gosh. Well, I'm just reading like a whole ton of stuff. I'm working on a big review article on the effects of physical activity on morbidity and mortality. So I'm reading a lot of literature right now on epidemiological literature. I'm reading a lot of literature on inflammation. I'm reading a lot of literature on locomotor biomechanics, because we have all kinds of things going on in the lab. So with different students and different projects, I've got different stuff going on. Actually just finished reading a whole slew of papers on the effects of exercise on metabolism. So I'm interested in, so most of the time, what's often called the afterburn, right? So most of the time when you exercise, your metabolic rate goes up. So what's going on when your metabolic rate goes up? What's your body doing? So yeah, there's always too much to read. That's the problem. There's too many people publish too much stuff.
I mean, yeah, it's exciting times. It's also exciting that it's so easily accessible. Every once in a while, I remember when I was a kid going to the library and pulling out an encyclopedia and just like sitting and like reading through a letter. Or when I got a little bit older, the Encarta CDs that you would put into your computer. It's really exciting to be living in a world where there's so much information so easily accessible, and it does sometimes feel like an overwhelming amount of wealth if such a thing could exist.
It makes it very hard though to sift, right? To figure out what to read and what not to read, and you have to be very tactical. You have to be kind of disciplined, and also when there's so much to read, I think it's hard to. Sometimes you have to remember to read skeptically, and sometimes because you're just inhaling so much, you have to slow down and ask yourself, is this true? Because that's what we need to do in science, right?
I think that's what everyone needs to do all the time. That's if you're on your Facebook feed and you see something, ask, is this true? Like, can I verify this through other sources? If someone on the street tells you something, there's a lot of different ways to consume things that aren't necessarily true or good.
And that's true of everything that all of us do. Science is about being wrong.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And this is something that we've talked a lot about on this show, is that sometimes people who aren't in science get really frustrated because they feel like scientists change their minds all the time. But that is a very good thing. And that is scientists' jobs, is when they get more information, they change their mind and they retest their hypotheses. We can all stand to be a little bit more like scientists, I think.
Yeah, I'm very suspicious of scientists who don't change their mind.
Oh, yeah. And you definitely see that. I feel like you're hanging out with a bunch of anthropologists and everyone's always like, oh, that one guy, Michigan, he hasn't changed his idea in like 30 years. Okay, well, thank you so much for your time. I would love to have you on again when your book comes out in September. This has really been a pleasure.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and have a great day.
You too.
Thanks for joining me for this episode of the Anthrobiology Podcast. If you have questions or comments, you can reach me at gabby.lapera@anthrobiology.com. That's spelled GABY.LAPERA@anthrobiology.com. This show was produced and edited by me. Music courtesy of Chad Crouch, aka Poddington Bear at Sound of Picture.